Hi all, today we are talking about Chapter 6 in Gibson's Ethics in Business and Introduction, and the Chapter 6 is about rights. So let's jump in. Let's get a definition first. Rights are entitlements to perform or not to perform certain actions, or to be or not to be in certain states, or entitlements that others perform or not perform certain actions, or be or not be in certain states. That definition is a little bit wonky. When you're thinking about rights, I mean, it's a pretty basic term. You think about people saying something like somebody is well within their rights to do something. That means they are allowed to do something. That can function as a basic understanding of the term. So where do rights come from? So they arise out of moral and legal theories, and they're based on powerful intuitions that human life is infinitely precious and people should not be used as mere means or mere tools for other people's ends. So this should remind you of when we were talking about the different moral theories and earlier in this class, and when we talked about deontology in particular. So this talk about rights arises out of moral theories, the same sort of intuitions that gave rise to deontological ethics. But deontology doesn't have a monopoly on rights talk. So talk of rights can arise out of social contract theory. It could even arise out of utilitarian moral theory, although the rights that utilitarians talk about wouldn't be very stringent. They'd be rights that could be overridden in order to maximize utility. But the important thing here, we all have this feeling that that the lives of people are precious, that people are not mere tools to be used for other people's ends. So this idea of rights, invoking the idea of rights, can conflict with maximizing utility, because rights trump, you hear this phrase, rights trump utility, meaning that maximizing utility is great. Maximizing overall well-being is great. But if we have to do that by violating somebody's rights, then the usual intuition here is that we shouldn't do that. And rights are also stronger than norms. So there's this idea that some rights are so basic that it doesn't matter what the prevailing norms are in a certain society. There are some rights that apply universally. Now, the book brings up a nice point here. They're applied to the workplace to prevent markets and human risk from arising. And this is especially visible right now when we hear a lot of talk about essential workers and how they have to risk their lives to provide these services. And we might wonder how they should be compensated for that sort of work. But here we're talking about a marketplace, right? And if the workers have sufficient bargaining power, and then they might be able to demand increases in pay. But usually we don't like it when there are markets for human risk. In the text, we'll talk about inalienable rights. So rights that people can't give away even if they tried. Rights that can't be taken away or given away even if people tried to do it. People have a right to not have their organs sold on the market. And why do we do that? We do that because we think human life is infinitely precious, and people shouldn't be allowed to risk their well-being by selling their organs, and people shouldn't be allowed to put other people's well-being in jeopardy. We shouldn't allow other people to put their well-being on the market by selling their organs, right? All right, so there are various categories of rights. So we can talk about rights generally along two axes here. The first axis is negative versus positive rights. So we talked about negative versus positive responsibilities. In this talk about rights mirrors that. So a negative right, no one needs to do anything to uphold a negative right. They provide immunities from outside interference. So a negative right is a prohibition of the way other people can act. So they don't need to do something to uphold it. Like, think here about the one way in which the right to life could be conceived is it's a right against other people that they refrain from killing you, right? At the very least, the right to life entails that they not kill you unjustly. And so other people don't need to take any special action to uphold that right. They just need to refrain from taking action against you, taking a specific sort of action in a specific sort of circumstance against you. On the other hand, positive rights do require action of others to uphold. The book does a nice job of explaining the difference between negative and positive rights in the context of, or uses Miranda rights to explain the difference between these. So you have a right to remain silent. Now, you don't have to do anything special to have that right, and nobody else needs to uphold that right for you. You just can stay silent, right? They don't need to uphold anybody else. Nobody else needs to uphold that right. But also included in your Miranda rights are the right to an attorney. Now, somebody does need to do something. The court needs to appoint an attorney to look after that right. So the right to remain silent, a negative right, the right to an attorney and fair representation, and a trial by peers, all those are positive rights that other people need to take action to uphold. Another axis that we could talk about rights along is the axis of natural rights versus privileges. So a natural right are those that we have in virtue of just being human beings. And privileges are those that we have in virtue of being a member of a certain society. And privileges can be scaled back or rescinded by legislative bodies. So when I think about a right that's more of a privilege, I think about driving. So if you have the right to get a car and to drive it so long as you don't accrue too many tickets or have especially bad infractions on your record, then you'll maintain the right to drive. Otherwise, you'll lose it. And that right can be taken away from you by legislative bodies. Similarly, a right to freely walk around outside could be taken away by a legislative body in the case of a pandemic like we're facing when I'm creating this video. So those would be privileges that could be taken away from you. There are discussions about whether there are natural rights that should never be taken away by that can't be taken away by legislative bodies, and if anybody does they don't take them away from you, they would just violate them, right? So rights to a right to life might be something that we would talk about as being a natural right, something that if somebody takes it away from you, they're violating your right, but they can't properly take away your right. They can act against in such a way that they would be violating your right, but not taking it away, right? Another category of right here is inalienable rights. So these are rights that can neither be taken nor given away. They're rights that, in a sense, are just stuck to you. So the book, again, to repeat, talks about the right not to have your organs sold on the market. That's considered an inalienable right, one that people can't take away from you, nor can you give it away. You have that right even against yourself in a weird sort of way. So you have that right against other people and against your own actions. right, so let's talk about some global initiatives that have been undertaken to ensure that people have rights. So there's something called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights undertook or introduced. And that ensures a number of rights: life, liberty, security, equality before the law, the right to a fair trial, right to work of one's choosing, fair wages, safe and healthy working conditions, holidays with pay, and explicitly the right to form unions and strike. As we'll see throughout this chapter, so much of the defense of workers' rights is dependent upon this right to form unions and to strike for better working conditions. And we'll see throughout this chapter the atrocities that can occur if people are not afforded that right. Then there's the global, and for the International Covenant, I think it said something like 147 countries have signed on to that covenant. And then there's the Global Compact. So the principles are pulled from the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Signatories, so companies that signed on, agree to embrace, support, and enact within their sphere of influence a set of core values in the areas of human rights, labor standards, the environment, and anti-corruption. Some 3,000 plus companies have voluntarily signed this compact, including big companies like Nike, which have had faced controversy with their human rights record in the past. And these things are great. One thing we should note, though, is that companies like this don't face any penalties if countries and companies don't face very strict punishments or any punishments at all if they violate the agreements that they're signing on to here. They're more symbolic, but they could provide levers for people to criticize the countries or the companies who are violating these compacts or covenants that they sign on to. So if they do sign on to them, we would have good leverage to say that that a country or company was going against its own principles if they violated some of the rights agreed to here, or that they would agree to uphold here. All right, so with those fundamentals as a background, let's look at a case study here. So the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta has rich oil reserves and is home to many indigenous groups, including the Ogoni tribe. In 1958, the Shell Corporation began drilling, built pipelines across farms that the Ogoni were farming on, churned up fields with large machines that they were farming on. They contaminated the water and soil from oil leaks, and it got so bad that through the burn-off of the oil, they were causing acid rain in the region. So things went south pretty quickly. The Ogoni tribe's farming and fishing were decimated by the practices of the Shell Corporation. After a massive 1993 oil spill, the Ogonis publicized a Bill of Rights and demanded compensation for the abuses and preventative measures be taken by Shell. I think they demanded something like $10 million in compensatory damages in compensation for the damages that the Shell Corporation had done. It sounds like a big number, but the Shell Corporation had made approximately $30 billion in extracting oil from the region, and as a consequence, these atrocities were happening to this tribe. In response to their Bill of Rights and some protesting, Shell colluded with the Nigerian government to have protesters arrested and hanged. When confronted, Shell said they didn't want to meddle in international affairs. So it's always funny to see how the principles of these corporations shift according to what's in their best interest. When local governments are taking measures to look after the corporate interest, the multinational corporations' interests, then the corporations will take a stance of, oh, we shouldn't be meddling in other countries' affairs. When foreign governments take measures that would go against these multinational corporate interests, then corporations quickly take the stance of, we need to look after American interests in the region. So when you hear those terms now, looking after American interests, think looking after large corporations that call America home. But other countries use that same sort of talk, right? So Shell colluded with the Nigerian government to brutally squash the protests. But lately, due to local and international pressure, Shell reluctantly has become involved in community building. Reluctantly became involved in community building efforts, building schools, giving money to build schools, and trying to make the relationships with the local people more tame. So, what sort of questions might arise from this case, and what are some takeaways from the case? So one question we might have do some rights exist over and above legal systems? In other words, are some rights natural? This case is particularly problematic because the Nigerian government signed on to Shell undertaking these projects and supported Shell taking these measures, which eventually led to horrible consequences for the people of the nation. Now, if we're going to say that well, so much the worse for the people of Nigeria, well, that really sucks, right? Then we're saying that if somebody's born under a corrupt government, then they're just out of luck. And if their government sells their well-being away to a multinational corporation, then so much the worse for those people. That's really morally unsavory at the least. Another question that comes out of this is, are some rights more basic or stringent than others? So one philosopher working in this area, Donaldson, on his view, property ownership and self-determination are fundamental because, he says, they're the conditions upon which any businesses are built. So we should not violate those rights, because if we do, think about a deontological perspective here. If we violating those rights is not universalizable, because a business could benefit from them, because if everybody were to violate those rights, businesses would cease to exist, right? So in this case, the Ogonis were robbed of at least the latter, self-determination, because they're no longer to farm and fish, because of the pollution and the wrecking of their farms and their traditional lands and the waters where they would fish. Are companies obligated to ensure that stakeholder rights are upheld? So recall again the stakeholder theory of corporations. That stakeholder theory said a corporation's obligations are not just to its shareholders, but also to everybody who comes in contact with the corporation. So the suppliers, the customers, the environment, the people the community around, the communities that are affected by the corporation doing its work. So are these companies obligated to ensure that all those stakeholders' rights are upheld? Another philosopher's view, Shu, his view is that there are rights we should not deprive people of. There are rights we should help protect people from being deprived of, and there are rights we should bring to the deprived. So where does the corporations how far does the corporation's obligations extend here? If we take the stakeholder view, it seems that there would be some rights that the corporation should be expected to, obligated to bring to the areas in which they work. So ensuring that the people in the areas in which they are going to be doing their work, that they have self-determination, that their property is not affected negatively, etc. Another topic that we should talk about here is the topic of sweatshops. So in industries that depend on thin profit margins and face fierce competitions, we often see them resort to using low-wage labor in brutal rights-violating conditions. Sweatshops often arise in developing nations where labor laws aren't as strict, where there hasn't been a history of organized labor movements. But they also appear in developed nations like the U.S. The text tells the story about of sweatshops in Manhattan where workers were working to produce clothing garments. And this often happens, especially amongst undocumented populations, so populations that can't make appeal or are scared or afraid to make appeal to governing bodies. So how can we prevent sweatshops from arising? Well, we can raise awareness when they do, raise awareness and boycott companies when they do, though that's often effective. And we can make sure that workers are allowed to organize and promote worker organizations so that they can look after their rights and that they have some bargaining power when they come to the table. And through measures like that, we can eliminate sweatshop conditions, or at least make them less prevalent. But in our attempts to minimize or to make it so that sweatshops aren't so prevalent, we need to be nuanced in our approach. We need to consider what constitutes a living wage. And it's a tricky issue because the answer will be culturally relative, and this complicates our analysis. The book tells the story in the beginning of a shipyard that used to break down ships. It was dangerous work, especially when the ships contained huge amounts of asbestos. And there was an area that was doing something like 90% of the ship breakdown. The large ship breakdown in the world. They had cornered the market. But the workers were facing particularly dangerous working conditions. However, so what ended up happening was an environmental group started protesting. The laws of the area changed. I think this is how it worked, that the laws of the area changed. And then what ended up happening? Did they still keep the market, and did they still have work, but just in better conditions? No. The large multinational corporations just started taking their ships elsewhere, where they could get them broken down with less red tape and paying lower wages. So as a result of that, there was tremendous, well, there was tremendous disappointment in the area. There were fewer jobs, and um, and there were protests against the environmental body that the environmental organization that got the ball rolling on that. So we do want to be careful in our analysis here that we're not just applying the rules and standards of one place to another place without any analysis of the cultures involved. All right, so rights and accountability. Who's obligated to preserve and protect rights? They're very important. There are many groups involved here, from governments to workers to customers, non-governmental organizations, corporations. Who is obligated to preserve and protect rights if they're so important? One possibility is governments. However, the hypocrisy when it comes to governments preserving and protecting rights is astounding. For example, the United States often cites records of human rights abuses in foreign countries, but has a history itself of allowing worker abuse domestically and suppressing governments supported by working workers abroad. Government, depending on the government, the records are not great. The U.S. is no exception to this. So what we might want to turn to instead of individual governments is larger governing bodies, so like the UN. The problem with that is that they aren't given much power to enforce the rights that they suggest. It's more, their role is more symbolic and suggestive instead of being able to make it happen. So another possibility is companies, and various organizations of companies have committed to preserving rights have arisen, and they agree to follow certain standards, to live up to certain standards and have certain kinds of practices. So that's a good thing, but again, if a company decides to violate it, it's not like there are going to be severe punishments from the other corporations, the other companies that are in the organization. So another possibility is non-governmental organizations. So groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, they can do a good job of publicizing rights abuses and getting the global community to act. Another possibility here is consumers. So if companies are violating workers' rights or the rights of human beings in the communities in which they operate, then consumers might take it upon themselves to boycott. The text gives an example of, it was cited in a paper called The New Student Movement, where students got the university to sell goods only that were only fair trade or union made or something like this, where workers were treated in a way that didn't violate their rights. So boycotting can be a powerful tool. The key here is organization, right? So organization. Workers need to organize to get to have more bargaining power when they're coming to the table, and consumers need to organize to make sure that that rights are being preserved. Another thing we should talk about here are the rights of non-humans. This is becoming more and more of an issue. So if we believe that all humans have rights, and if we believe that that is because all humans share some feature that makes it so that we deserve rights, then we would have to recognize that that feature is a very basic feature. I mean, think of the variety of human beings. Not all human beings are intelligent. Not all human beings are self-aware. Not all human beings are moral human beings. And when I use those terms, I mean like strictly speaking, not in the colloquial sense. So some human beings face severe mental disabilities, and they are not able to reason, and they're not able to think morally. Some human beings are too young to reason or to think morally. So if we're going to extend rights to those human beings as well, then, and if we're going to say that rights, why we deserve rights is because we have some essential feature that makes us deserving of rights, then we're going to have to realize that it's a very basic feature that we share with human beings that are unable to reason, unable to think morally. So what sort of feature might that be? One proposal here is just sentience, so the ability to feel. And if we base rights on just the ability to feel, then we're going to have to recognize that many, many non-human animals have that ability as well. So if we're going to grant humans rights, and it's going to be based on a feature that we all human beings' rights, and it's going to be based on a feature that we all share, then many non-human animals are going to share that as well, and they'll deserve rights also. Now, this would restrict many of the ways which we use animals in food production. So if the criteria for rights is sentience and not sapience, so sapience being our higher level mental functioning, sentience being our lower level mental functioning, if our lower level mental functioning is the feature that grants us rights, then, or that underwrites our rights, then animals share that feature, and it would and we would need to recognize that the animals we use in producing food share that feature. So cows, chickens, pigs are all sentient, right? They all feel things. Things can go better or worse for them. They can experience pleasure and pain. And if they have rights, then based on them being sentient, then we'd have to change so much in terms of our food production. Especially, I mean, if you want to look into, I'm not going to talk about it much here, but if you want to look into the abuses that animals face in our factory farming practices, it's horrific. There are very few topics on which there's a consensus among contemporary philosophers. This is one topic about which there's practically a consensus. It's something like 85% plus of contemporary philosophers will say that factory farming practices are immoral. We'd also have to look at pharmaceutical research. So often chimps are used for pharmaceutical research, and they're not only sentient, but they also share some of the other higher level mental capacities that we enjoy. And so if we have rights, it's not clear why they would not have rights. And if they do have rights, then now we have to think we're probably not allowed to keep them in cages. We're probably not allowed to experiment on them without their consent. So do non-human animals have rights? Is an issue we should consider, and that's relevant in business ethics because businesses are using these animals to produce their products. Another issue the text talks about is perhaps some natural object. We might think of some natural objects as being candidates for rights and deserving of legal representation. We won't go too much into that, but it's an interesting issue. So let's sum this all up. Discussions of rights arise from strongly held intuitions about the value of human beings. While their invocation may thwart utility maximization, so maximizing well-being in the world, they are necessary for protecting individuals and groups in a global economy that has produced corporations that enjoy considerable threat advantages. So I haven't made a big deal about this term threat advantage yet. Let me make a big deal of it now. So many of the rights abuses that we see are when big multinational corporations go to operate in a developing nation or are negotiating with a developing nation to operate within their borders. And in that developing nation, they haven't had many organized labor movements that would protect workers. So the corporation has a huge threat advantage. They can tell that developing nation, we're going to start operating within your country, and it will improve conditions a little bit for the people of your country, and the government of this country will enjoy some benefits, but we're not going to improve conditions much. Things are going to be great for us, big multinational corporation. They're going to be slightly better for you, but there are going to be some severe side effects. And we saw that in the case of Shell operating in the Niger Delta. So when corporations enjoy considerable threat advantage, a strict utilitarian might say something like, well, they're maximizing well-being. They'll bring jobs to the area. Yeah, working conditions won't be great, but at least there will be some more jobs in this area where people are struggling. So maybe we should just allow the corporation to do that. And the price of the product will come down globally because they're relying on cheap labor. It sounds cold-blooded, and it is. Now, why is talk of rights especially important in that circumstance? Because it will protect the people in those developing countries. So if it becomes publicized, the hardships that that the workers of the country are facing, then maybe those conditions can be improved, and we can improve the conditions of life for people globally, and that's really important. Another takeaway here is general rights claims are less effective than publicizing how particular companies are going against their own standards of practice. So using those agreements that governments and corporations are signing on to as levers to try to bring about change. And finally, we need to be conscious of cultural context when appealing to rights. We do want to try to ensure that these big multinational corporations are not just taking their business elsewhere without penalties, because then the people of the developing nation are just out of luck. So this is why giving international governing bodies some more power to affect these negotiations, to weigh in on these negotiations might be the way to go, but also boycotts and coming from the ground up at this problem might be a way to go as well. All right, so thanks for sticking with me through that. Let's get to some quiz questions for you. So quiz question number 1. Natural rights are those, A, that legislative bodies can grant and remove, B, that we have in virtue just of being human, or C, that always require the actions of others to uphold. Natural rights. Which are those? Question 2, true or false? Considerations of rights are especially important when large multinational corporations negotiate and act with considerable threat advantage. Is that true or false? Make sure you take the answers down in your notes, because when you open the quiz on Canvas, the options won't be filled in for you. Thanks for sticking with me through this lecture. Hopefully it illuminated some things, and we'll pick up again for the next chapter. Have a good one.